Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus Weekend Edition, powered by the Center Square. I'm Greg Bishop, Illinois editor at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week for Illinois in Focus, the Center Square reporter Jim Talamonte and I will discuss fallout from last week's veto session, continued debate about the management of the state's prisons, and the upcoming primary election season. All of that and more when we return for more Illinois in Focus Weekend Edition, powered by the Center Square.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Last week's veto session went well into the early morning hours Halloween, where legislators approved a slew of controversial legislation using more tax dollars to pay for mass transit, further expansion of the state's alternative energy programs, and more. The Center Square's Jim Talamonte and I followed that, and he joins us to discuss some of that and more. Jim, one measure that was approved was an expansion of the state's migrant sanctuary policies. You watched through debate in both the House and Senate on that. What exactly does this bill do, and what are some of the concerns that there are?
Well, that's a great question. There are a lot of concerns, Greg, and expressed by people on both sides of the aisle, but especially Republicans. And in terms of what this bill exactly is going to do, I think State Rep Patrick Windhorst, who's the Republican floor leader in the House, said, well, we don't know. The answer is we don't know. And although a lot of the preliminary discussion about this bill revolved around sanctuary enhancements, this bill aims to quote unquote protect or prevent, depending on how you say, prevent federal immigration enforcement at certain locations. This would involve hospitals and healthcare facilities, courthouses, college campuses, and daycare centers in particular. And it would, according to Illinois House Speaker Chris Welch and State Senate President Don Harmon, these were the two legislative leaders, and the supermajority pushed this through in both houses, both chambers. And so Welch said, we're creating a private right of action to enforce these protections. In other words, the ability to file lawsuits. So the issue, though, is that the provisions of the bill language here that don't only apply to federal law enforcement officials. They could apply to others, groups and individuals. And so Windhorst said this could have many unintended consequences. We don't know who's going to be subject to civil liability here. So there was a lot of concern in the law enforcement community, the state and local law enforcement community, about this eliminating qualified immunity for police officers. Well, that provision was included. So John Cabello, a McChesney Park Republican, also a law enforcement officer, thanked the speaker for adding that. He said, even though he opposed the legislation, there was great opposition from police chief organizations, sheriffs around the state about that part. But as far as who else could be vulnerable here to lawsuits, well, that's still kind of an open-ended question. And so for as much as Senate President Harmon and Speaker Welch gave lengthy speeches both in committee and on the House and Senate floor, respectively, about immigration. We must stand up in this moment, especially Welch, adding, pauses to add dramatic effect to his floor speech. When you really look closely at this legislation, it seems to me that it's really more about litigation than immigration. And when you look into the numbers, it's not new that the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association has given a lot of money to both Harmon and Welch, including 25,000 donations to each's political action fund campaign during the summer. And in addition to campaigns to individual lawmakers and House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and the Democratic Party of Illinois. So a lot of money going from the Trial Lawyers Association to House and Senate Democrats in Illinois. Now, the ITLA said they have no comment on this legislation. I was a little surprised that Illinois Citizens Against Lawsuit Abuse also didn't have a comment, but there's a lot of potential here for a lot of litigation because of this bill, which, as Patrick Windhorst says, this could be unconstitutional in terms of the provision making federal law enforcement officers vulnerable to lawsuits or exposed to lawsuits, because the federal law trumps state law. So that part of this may not even go through, in which case you're exposing, people other than federal law enforcement to litigation, which this bill was supposed to address just that, federal immigration enforcement. So a lot of questions, more questions than answered after this bill passed in the late hours of the fall veto session.
Well, it's interesting that you're kind of predicting there could be lawsuits, because even House Speaker Chris Welch and Senate President Don Harmon fully expect there to be lawsuits against this legislation, and acknowledging that even when they introduced it. Obviously, that was just one thing we were expecting to happen during fall veto session, Jim. But, with as long as it went into and people still recovering after that midnight run that went until 4:30 in the morning, Halloween morning in the Illinois Senate. One of the things that they did, and I remember being in the basement, and we got word that about 2:30 in the morning, the Illinois Senate was going to take up medical aid in dying legislation as a way to fill the time before they got the transit bill. And that's exactly what happened. Tell us what you know about that medical assisted suicide bill.
Yeah, well, the proponents say it's aid in dying. Opponents say this is just that, assisted suicide. And so at about 3 a.m., State Senator Linda Holmes presented her bill, the, quote, Terminally Ill Patients Act, so adults with less than 6 months to live could request a prescription to, she said, self-end their suffering. Now, she said, Holmes did, that the bill includes over 20 safeguards, confirmation from 2 physicians that the patient only has 6 months or less to live, mental competency, etc. But Republican State Rep Bill Hodder, who's a physician, says even with such measures, the bill violates doctors' do no harm oath and could expand beyond its intended limits. And he said, Hodder, that this bill lets patients obtain and use the medication without medical supervision. So this creates concerns that, that medication could end up in somebody else's hands. And there's no requirement to have medical personnel around, Hodder said, when the person self-administers this. And so a lot of questions here about this. And Hodder also, as a number of people did, said, well, this is, to have this happening at 2 a.m., not, something that was talked about. We knew going into fall veto session that energy, transit, these were going to be big things. We didn't know that this aid in dying legislation that did not survive, pardon the pun, in the spring session, would be revived during the fall veto session. That was not necessarily expected. It was apparently planned behind closed doors all along. But if Governor Pritzker signs it, Illinois would join 11 other states now and Washington, D.C. in legalizing some form of physician-assisted suicide. And one of the issues brought up in committee about this bill was that, and I'm trying to remember, it may have been State Senator McClure, but he brought up the fact that, there's a heavy rate of depression. I wasn't realized among veterinarians. And part of that reason is because they administer lethal injections to pets who are dying. And now this could affect people in the medical industry. So one of those other potential unintended consequences of this legislation. But supporters, have brought it forth numerous times now, and this time it finally got through the legislature. And according to State Senator Laura Fine, she said, this is not suicide, it's compassion. Those were her words. So a lot of division about this one, a lot of controversy. There was a reaction from people in various faith communities opposing this, but it's going to the governor. And I think it'd be surprising if he didn't sign it.
And something that, again, in the faith community, Springfield Bishop Thomas John Paprocki talked about how this was passed on Halloween morning, which kind of makes it that much more, I guess, as you could see, a salient point for for those in the faith community. So we'll
Grim Reaper, the Grim Reaper bill.
we'll track to see where that measure ultimately does end up on the governor's desk, and he's expected to sign it. But Jim, not everything got across the finish line before the end of veto session. There was one measure that was hotly debated in both chambers and it passed the Senate, but when it got to the House, a measure impacting homeowners insurance didn't quite get enough votes.
Very interesting. The opposition here came from both the right and a certain faction on the left in terms of the Illinois House, and the People's House had some strong opinions on this. Now, this legislation was intended to regulate the home insurance industry because of what lawmakers are saying, the increases in home insurance premiums. There's been a push to regulate auto insurance rates that the Secretary of State is pushing, and he's probably going to continue pushing very hard into the spring. And so on this measure, State Rep Jeff Kiker, who was an insurance agent, has worked in that business for a long time, said this bill was not going to address the costs that have angered consumers. And he said, I'll be happy to work or even co-sponsor a bill that does the right things, that regulates the industry the right way. This one doesn't do it. He said everyone will, with a homeowner's policy, will pay more because of the uncertainty. And this measure would give a lot of extra authority to the Illinois Department of Insurance, allowing it to basically reject any rates it found to be unfair, too high, discriminatory, et cetera. So a lot of kind of open-ended authority to the Illinois Department of Insurance to regulate insurers. State Senator Michael Hastings supported the legislation, said these aren't radical changes. This is protecting consumers. But Senator Dave Severson, another one who will spend a lot of time, has worked in insurance, spent a lot of time talking about insurance, said, this is about control. Illinois has competition. More than 200 companies sell home insurance products. Other states that regulate things don't have that competition, and people pay more. Illinois homeowner rates, while they've gone up, they're not as high as we see in other states just because of that competition. So, and interesting, the opposition from the Democratic Party came from Thaddeus Jones of Calumet City, who said, he told Robin Gable, who's the chief House sponsor of this bill, he said, why aren't we attacking the auto industry and putting them into this as well? So only Illinois, perhaps, would you ask, why aren't we attacking industry more? But, and Gable said, well, I think we're going to look at auto insurance next year. Well, Jones said, no, it should be included. He urged a no vote and voted against it because it wasn't going to regulate enough of the insurance business. So, this is a debate that's not going to go away. We'll likely see it, in January or February or at some point in the spring session. But for now, opposition from both sides to this measure, which would have regulated the home insurance industry. But again, we're likely to see insurance regulation become a really hot topic, both for homeowners and auto insurance, when we get into the 2026 session.
Yeah, it's almost like this was a bit of a preview of some of the stuff we may hear about early in spring session, but that's not going to come until sometime in January, Jim, as legislators finished out veto session. Those were the last remaining days of the calendar year that they had scheduled, unless somehow there's a special session that's called, and who knows, that could possibly tackle something like redistricting, which I think is something we need to keep our eyes on. Again, you can find out more about all of these stories and more. Go to thecentersquare.com, get the newsletter in your inbox simply by clicking on newsletter, and then you'll wake up with those headlines in your inbox each and every weekday morning. Also want to encourage people to check out Illinois in Focus daily on the Center Square's YouTube channel. Jim, something else that did happen at veto session was a long time coming, and that was Governor J.B. Pritzker's appointment of LaToya Hughes to be the Illinois Department of Corrections Director. This finally came to a vote in the final hours of veto session last week.
Yeah, LaToya Hughes, by the Department of Corrections, other than Department of Children and Family Services, I don't know that any department has faced more scrutiny, questioning, criticism, call it what you want, than the Department of Corrections, where things just seem to have been deteriorating quite a lot here in recent years in terms of transparency, lack of information, and in the case of Department of Corrections, just issues inside of state facilities. And so Hughes had been acting director for well over 2 years, about 2.5 years. And Republican lawmakers said, we need to get this to a vote. You know, there was Jason Plummer in committee and on the Senate floor several times in spring and fall has called out Hughes. Well, she seems like a nice person, but we're not getting answers. And he's come out and said essentially that she has lied about things. He said there are very few people who come before executive appointments, referring to that committee, which he serves on, whose incompetence leads to deaths, whose incompetence leads to danger, and who lies to members of this body. Those were Jason Plummer's words. He's not someone who will hold back when he has a strong statement to make, but even so, it was a rather emphatic statement, even by Plummer standards on the Senate floor, and others questioned her as well. Terry Bryant has done a lot of her own work investigating Department of Corrections facilities, and she says, you know, she had to get a Freedom of Information Act request and an order from the Illinois Attorney General's office just to get documents showing fentanyl-related deaths of Departments of Correction inmates last year and into the first month of this year. And she said these were just the deaths of fentanyl involving inmates. So they were not talking about staff exposures, people who were sickened, and you know, other cases involving injuries, et cetera, or fentanyl affected behavior, those kind of things. She said, and Brian used to work in the Department of Corrections. She said, no one has seen the amount of drugs and the amount of cell phone usage in the Department of Corrections that's happened in recent years. So, a lot to get to in this, but the Senate, in spite of the criticism of LaToya Hughes, voted in favor of her nomination. So her salary as director will go up to, I believe, about $220,000 a year after being around $200,000 as acting director. And, but there's still a lot of questions from both sides of the aisle, because there were committee hearings in which the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, which is going to address electronic mail scanning next month, where the department's trying to get permanent rules in place before the practice can lapse. Tarver said, we need to move it along here, and there have been a lot of frustrations from lawmakers about the delays just getting anything done and any kind of information or movement in terms of lawmaker-approved activities by the Department of Corrections.
Jim, obviously the Department of Corrections is a major, state agency that's got its own problems. And one of the big problems was highlighted during debate on LaToya Hughes's appointment. And with the Senate approving her, that of course puts that issue to the side. I'm sure that the Republicans are going to demand more accountability, but there's also the ongoing issue of prison mail scanning. And this is something that's been talked about for months. I remember even years ago, Republicans and members of prison staff were pushing for something like this because they had already been encountering illicit substances getting into the prison system via inmates' mail. Well, there was a public hearing this week focused on that issue. You tapped into that. What were some of the things discussed?
Yeah, the department held this in Springfield this week, and the department was getting input from members of the community, advocates, opponents, prison staff, et cetera, on electronic mail scanning. How's it going? Lawmakers were very frustrated that it wasn't implemented until late September. They were expecting that to happen sooner, but it was implemented. And so testimony, there was definitely a division in terms of opinions. Workers at Illinois correctional facilities talked about the great impact of mail scanning. Janelle Fitzgerald, who's a local AFSCME president at Lawrence Correctional Center in Sumner, said they're relieved that mail scanning is in place. She said there was haze and smoke in the housing units where inmates live, and she said it's a relief to not leave work with a headache each day. Another correctional officer, Nick McLaughlin, said at Graham Correctional Center in Hillsborough, there's been a recent explosion in terms of drug activity, but now, since mail scanning's been in place the last few weeks, things have changed dramatically, and the assaults against prison officers and prison staff, they have diminished. Instead of being almost a daily occurrence, it's now down to 1 or 2 a week. So they're saying there's a great improvement. On the other hand, inmate advocates, well, they're opposed. They say that this is a barrier. The getting real mail makes a real difference for people who are missing their family, their friends, their loved ones. There are potential issues involving property rights of incarcerated people. Also, interesting commentary from Ashton Claycamp of the Education Justice Project at the University of Illinois, saying that, a lot of inmates are, though they're incarcerated, they're able to participate in online or higher education. They're able to get publications and such, and this is a barrier to their education. So a lot of opposition from various groups who are advocates for inmates. But on the other hand, prison staff and corrections officers saying it's been a real positive so far. But there could be a lapse in this mail scanning if a permanent rule, this is being done under a temporary rule granted by the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, but that's going to end in mid-January. So if a new permanent rule isn't implemented by December at the December JCAR meeting, well, then there will almost certainly be a lapse, and we could go back to having no mail scanning. And again, lawmakers have expressed a lot of frustration with LaToya Hughes and the Department of Corrections for not moving quickly enough. And State Rep Stephen Reich essentially said that you're almost at the point here where it's almost impossible for you to get this permanent rule in place without having a lapse. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that here. There's a JCAR meeting coming up here in the next couple of weeks, and that's going to be a crucial one for the Department of Corrections if they're going to avoid having this lapse in electronic mail scanning with the intention of keeping contraband out of prisons.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable and stuff that you can read at thecentersquare.com. Encourage you to get the newsletter in your inbox just by signing up at thecentersquare.com. Jim, obviously IDOC, the Department of Corrections, we've talked a lot about that already. One thing I did want to touch on was what's our continued coverage on other agencies that are troubled. So right up there with IDOC is the Department of Children and Family Services, which has been just mired with all kinds of troubling stories and poor audits and more. And I'll tell you, Jim, we've now waited almost 3 weeks here to get information on how many missing children there are that DCFS is tracking. And when I put my FOIA request in for the Center Square on October 21st, figured we could get a number pretty quick within 5 business days. They have to respond, but they replied and said that they're still looking for those numbers. They needed another 5-day extension. Jim, I still have yet to get anything back, and here we are almost 3 weeks now with the 15 business day mark being Friday. I'm not sure what's going on there. We're going to keep them accountable and keep pushing for those numbers. But this story obviously highlights, at least for State Senator Chapin Rose, who's on the Legislative Audit Commission, that DCFS has an accountability issue. And he says that it goes all the way up to the top right there where Governor J.B. Pritzker is at the helm. And speaking of that, Jim, I imagine all of these issues, and from the RTA bailout to the issues surrounding energy policy to the management of state agencies, we are rapidly, if not already, in the March primary season. And you've got Governor J.B. Pritzker not being challenged in the Democrat primary. We've got an array of Republicans running. But obviously, there's a lot to watch, and something that we'll do at the Center Square.
It's hard to believe we're only 4 months from the primary. So things are really going to heat up here as we get into election season.
They're going to heat up and speed up. Breakneck speed, I think, is what we're going to be feeling here very soon, Jim. And we'll be covering it all at thecentersquare.com. Jim, thank you so much for taking time with us today. And I encourage people to go to thecentersquare.com to get the newsletter and read these and so many other stories, and also the investigative series that we are developing more and more at thecentersquare.com.